January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick and relentless, covering the frozen corpses scattered across the hillside like a shroud of mercy. In the pale light of dawn, Private First Class Raymond Hollis crouched behind a shattered oak, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. His hands, raw and cracked from weeks of winter warfare, gripped a rifle that should not have existed, a weapon cobbled together from salvaged metal, aircraft aluminum, and sheer desperation. The barrel, fashioned from a damaged P-47 Thunderbolt's landing strut, caught the first rays of morning sun. 20 yards ahead, shadows moved between the trees. German soldiers advancing through the fog, their field gray uniforms merging with the colorless landscape. Hollis pressed his cheek against the makeshift stock, feeling the cold bite of improvised steel. He had been a farm boy from Iowa just 18 months earlier. Now he was something else entirely, something the war had forged from necessity and survival. The sound that would echo through this particular hollow of history had not yet been made, but it was coming. In the next 4 hours, 20 men would fall to a weapon that existed nowhere in any military manual, built by hands that had once only known how to coax life from soil, not take it with such terrible precision. To understand how Raymond Hollis came to that frozen hillside with his impossible rifle, one must travel backward, through time, across an ocean, to a place where the machinery of modern war seemed as distant as the moon. Hollis had grown up in the flatlands of southeastern Iowa, in a farming community called Morning Sun, where the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction and the only sounds were wind, through cornfields and the rhythmic clang of his father's blacksmith hammer. The Hollis family worked 60 acres of stubborn land, coaxing wheat and corn from soil that seemed to hold grudges against easy harvests. Raymond was the youngest of 4 brothers, born in 1924, into a world still recovering from one world war and teetering toward another. His father, Samuel Hollis, had served in the Great War, returning from France with a limp and a toolbox full of German wrenches he'd salvaged from destroyed artillery positions. Samuel never spoke of what he'd seen in the Argonne forest, but he channeled something of that experience into his work. The Hollis barn became a laboratory of improvisation, a place where broken tractors were resurrected, where scrap metal transformed into functional tools, where the philosophy of rural American ingenuity met the hard pragmatism of economic depression. Young Raymond absorbed these lessons not through words, but through observation, standing beside his father at the forge, watching how heat and pressure could reshape steel, how patience could solve problems that force could not. By the age of 14, Raymond could repair any piece of farm equipment in the county. By 16, he had built his first firearm, a crude but functional rifle fashioned from pipe metal and spare parts, designed for hunting rabbits that plagued the family's garden. His teachers at Morning Sun High School noted his aptitude for mathematics and mechanical drawing, but there was little money for college, and besides, the world had other plans. In the autumn of 1942, as Raymond helped his father bring in the last harvest before winter, the news from across both oceans grew increasingly grim. The war that had seemed so distant was swallowing the globe. His oldest brother, Thomas, had already enlisted in the Navy. The second, William, was training with an Army tank division in North Carolina. By December, after the last of the corn had been stored and the first hard frost had locked the fields in winter sleep, Raymond made his decision. He enlisted on December 18, 1942, 3 days after his 18th birthday, walking into the recruiting office in Burlington with his father's blessing and his mother's tears still wet on his collar. The recruiter, a staff sergeant with a chest full of ribbons from the Pacific Campaign, looked at the tall, lean farm boy and saw infantry material. Raymond scored exceptionally high on the mechanical aptitude tests, high enough that the Army considered routing him to engineering or ordnance units. But the need for riflemen was insatiable. By February 1943, he was at Fort Benning, Georgia, learning to kill with standardized weapons, though his mind never stopped analyzing how each one worked, where its weaknesses lay, how it might be improved. The German soldiers advancing through the Ardennes that January morning carried their own stories of expectation and disillusionment. They had been told, in the propaganda that flowed through Wehrmacht briefing rooms and Nazi party rallies, that Americans were soft, that their army was a disorganized mob of factory workers and farm boys who would crumble under the disciplined assault of the German war machine. They had been assured that American industry, for all its vaunted production capacity, created quantity without quality mass-produced rifles that jammed, tanks that broke down, soldiers who preferred jazz music and Hollywood films to the serious business of warfare. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, leading a squad of 9 men through the frozen forest that morning, had absorbed these lessons during his training in Bavaria. He was 23 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Stalingrad and been rewarded with assignment to the Western Theater, which was supposed to be easier, softer. He carried a Karabiner 98K rifle, a weapon of renowned German engineering, precise and reliable. His men moved with the confidence of soldiers who had been victorious for so long. That defeat seemed a temporary aberration, something that would be corrected once Germany deployed its promised wonder weapons. Once the Americans revealed their fundamental weakness, they expected to find disorganized American units, scattered and demoralized by the surprise German offensive that had shattered the Allied lines in December. They expected chaos. What they encountered instead was something the propaganda had never prepared them for: an improvised lethality that seemed to emerge from the American character itself, a dangerous creativity born of frontier individualism and industrial ingenuity. Raymond Hollis had arrived in Europe in September 1944, landing at Normandy 3 months after D-Day, when the beaches had been cleared, but the bocage country of France still ran red with daily casualties. He was assigned to the 99th Infantry Division, a unit that would soon be thrown into the breach during the Battle of the Bulge. His service record noted his skill as a marksman, but it was his other talent that would prove more significant. During the autumn advance through France and Belgium, as his unit pressed toward the German border, Hollis became the unofficial armorer for his platoon. Combat has a way of revealing the weaknesses in even the most carefully designed systems. The M1 Garand rifle, for all its revolutionary semi-automatic capability, suffered in the mud and cold. Trigger assemblies froze, gas systems clogged. When official replacement parts were delayed by overburdened supply lines, soldiers made do or died. Hollis made miracles. Using tools scavenged from destroyed vehicles and abandoned workshops, he kept weapons functioning. He fabricated replacement firing pins from salvaged aircraft metal. He jury-rigged sights. He became known as the man who could fix anything, and soldiers from other platoons began appearing at his foxhole with broken weapons and desperate hope. The rifle he carried into the Ardennes was born of necessity and evolution. His issued M1 Garand had been damaged beyond simple repair. During a German artillery barrage in early December, the receiver cracked, the barrel bent. Rather than turn it in for a replacement that might never arrive, Hollis saw an opportunity. In a bombed-out Belgian village, he found the wreckage of a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter plane, its fuselage torn open, but its landing gear strut intact. The strut was made of high-grade steel alloy, precisely the right diameter for a rifle barrel. Using a damaged lathe in an abandoned machine shop, working by candlelight during 3 consecutive nights while his unit rested, he fashioned a new barrel. The stock came from a destroyed German Mauser, sanded and modified. The trigger mechanism combined parts from 2 different M1 carbines. The sight was improvised from components he could barely identify in the darkness. The result was a weapon that should not have worked. It violated every principle of standardized military production. It had no serial number, no manufacturer's mark, no place in any supply system. But when Hollis test fired it in a snowy field behind the lines, it fired true, more than true. The heavier barrel reduced recoil, the modified trigger pull was smoother, and the sight picture was clearer than his original rifle. He had created, through improvisation and midnight labor, a precision instrument from the detritus of war. The philosophy behind this creation was quintessentially American, though Hollis would never have articulated it in such terms. It was the same impulse that had driven his father to rebuild engines from scrap, that had motivated generations of American farmers and mechanics to solve problems with available materials, rather than wait for proper tools. It was the frontier spirit channeled into industrial warfare, the democracy of improvisation that assumed any individual with skill and determination could create solutions without waiting for authority to provide them. When the German offensive exploded across the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, the 99th Infantry Division found itself directly in the path of the assault. The surprise was total. Entire units were surrounded, overrun, or forced into desperate retreats through frozen forests. Hollis's company became separated from the larger division. fighting a series of running battles as they tried to rejoin friendly lines. For weeks, they existed in a state of near-constant combat, supplied by airdrops when the weather permitted, more often living off captured German rations and whatever they could scavenge. It was during these weeks that Hollis's rifle proved its worth. In conventional combat, it performed admirably, but its true value emerged in the role of designated marksman, his platoon leader. Lieutenant James Overton, a former schoolteacher from Massachusetts, recognized that Hollis's weapon was more accurate at distance than the standard infantry rifles. He began using Hollis as a sniper, though that term was never formally applied, in the fluid, chaotic combat of the Bulge, where battles erupted suddenly in fog and forest. The ability to eliminate specific threats at 200 or 300 yards could mean the difference between a successful defense and annihilation. Hollis killed his first man on December 21, 1944, a German officer, identifiable by his binoculars and map case, directing troops from the edge of a tree line. The distance was 230 yards. Hollis steadied his rifle against a fallen log, controlled his breathing as he had been taught, adjusted for the slight crosswind, and squeezed the trigger. The officer fell. The German attack, deprived of immediate leadership, faltered long, enough for Hollis's platoon to retreat to a more defensible position. He felt no elation, no horror, only a grim recognition that he had crossed a threshold that could never be recrossed. The farm boy who had once aimed carefully to avoid killing even the rabbits that threatened his family's garden had become an instrument of precise death. Over the following weeks, the number grew. German machine gunners, mortar crews, soldiers, who exposed themselves for just a moment too long. Hollis kept no count, maintained no record, but his platoon mates noticed. They began to trust that when Hollis fired, something important on the other side stopped functioning. They began to understand that his improvised rifle, this weapon built from aircraft parts and salvaged components, was worth more than a dozen standard-issue firearms. The German soldiers, for their part, began to experience a cognitive dissonance that would have profound psychological effects. They had been trained to expect certain things from combat: the crack of Mauser rifles, the chatter of MG-42 machine guns, the particular sounds and rhythms of mechanized warfare. But there was something different about this sector of the line, something they could not quite identify. Men fell to shots that seemed to come from impossible distances. The sound was wrong, not quite American, not quite German, something in between. There were whispers among some units of a ghost sniper, an American marksman who used a weapon unlike any other. Klaus Richter heard these rumors as his squad moved through the forest. On the morning of January 17th, he dismissed them as the kind of superstitious nonsense that infected tired soldiers. The war was going badly. Even the most optimistic men could see that now. But it would not be decided by ghost stories. The offensive had stalled, then reversed. The Americans were pushing back, slowly, methodically, with that terrible material superiority that German soldiers had learned to fear more than any individual valor. But Richter had his orders. His squad was part of a reconnaissance patrol, tasked with identifying American positions before a planned withdrawal. Find them, mark them, return. Simple enough if one was careful. They moved in dispersed formation, maintaining proper intervals, weapons ready. The snow had stopped falling, but lay thick on the ground, muffling sound. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as forests become when violence has passed through them too many times. Richter signaled for his men to pause, to watch and listen. Nothing moved. They advanced another 50 meters. Still nothing. He began to think they might complete the mission without contact, that they might be the lucky ones who survived this day. Raymond Hollis saw them the moment they emerged from a depression in the terrain. He was positioned on a small rise, camouflaged, with a white bedsheet liberated from a destroyed farmhouse, his rifle resting on a makeshift bipod constructed from broken fence pickets. He had been in position since before dawn, sent forward by Lieutenant Overton to watch the approaches to their position. The cold had long since penetrated through his layers of clothing, but he had learned to ignore it, to exist in a state of patient alertness. That farming had prepared him for the same mindset required to wait for the right moment to harvest, to repair, to act. He counted 9 men in the German patrol. They moved well, with the caution of experienced soldiers. He could see their breath in the cold air, could see how they scanned the tree line, how they communicated with hand signals. They were professionals. They would find his platoon's position within the hour if left unchecked. He settled the crosshairs of his improvised sight on the lead soldier, the one whose bearing suggested command. The distance was 180 yards, not particularly challenging, no wind to speak of. The only variable was his own heartbeat, his own breathing. He exhaled slowly, let his finger rest on the trigger his grandfather's pocket watch had helped construct, and fired. The sound of the shot rolled across the frozen landscape like thunder in a bottle. Klaus Richter heard it a fraction of a second before the bullet struck him in the upper chest, just below the collarbone, angled slightly downward. He fell without understanding what had happened, the snow cushioning his collapse, his rifle tumbling from numb fingers. His squad scattered instinctively, seeking cover behind trees and fallen logs. They returned fire toward the approximate direction of the shot, but they were firing blind. Panicked, Hollis had already moved, sliding backward down the reverse slope of his position, relocating to a spot 30 yards to the left, where he had prepositioned a secondary firing point. The German soldiers' training took over. They bounded by pairs, attempting to flank the position where they thought the sniper was hiding. Two men broke from cover, running low toward a cluster of boulders. Hollis fired twice. Rapidly, both men fell. The remaining 6 soldiers froze, caught between the instinct to help their fallen comrades and the survival imperative to remain concealed. Hollis used the pause to move again, this time to a third position he had prepared, a natural depression that provided both cover and a clear field of fire. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a methodical elimination, a grim mathematics of angles and timing. The German soldiers tried to retreat, to break contact, but Hollis had positioned himself to control the most obvious exit routes. When 3 men tried to run together, using suppressive fire to cover their movement, he shot the trailing man first, then the leader, leaving the middle soldier isolated and psychologically shattered. When the survivors tried to dig into defensive positions, he shot them as they moved, as they reloaded, as they made any motion that revealed their location. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. When it ended, 20 German soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow, not 9. The original patrol had been reinforced during the fight by a second squad that had heard the firing and moved to support, only to walk into the same killing ground. Hollis had expended 32 rounds from his improvised rifle. He did not miss often. His hands shook when it was over, not from fear, but from the cold and from something else. Some fundamental recognition of what he had done, what he had become, capable of doing. Lieutenant Overton arrived with the rest of the platoon 20 minutes later. Having heard the sustained firing, they found Hollis sitting beside his weapon, methodically cleaning the barrel with the cloth torn from his undershirt. The battlefield was a tableau of death spread across pristine snow, already being obscured by fresh flurries. Overton looked at the bodies, looked at Hollis's rifle, looked at the young man whose face seemed to have aged years in a single morning. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He radioed the company commander to report the contact, mentioning only that an enemy patrol had been neutralized. The specifics seemed strange to explain over a radio net. The German High Command, in its official records, would note only that 2 reconnaissance patrols failed to return from Sector 7 of the Ardennes front on January 17, 1945. The loss was attributed to enemy action, cause unspecified. No special significance was attached to the incident. 20 men among hundreds of thousands dead and missing. But for the individual soldiers who heard the rumors, who saw the aftermath, who understood that something unexpected had happened, in that frozen forest, the incident carried a different weight. The psychological impact of such encounters accumulated across thousands of similar incidents. Throughout the final months of the war, German soldiers had expected to face American troops who relied entirely on material superiority, who won through sheer weight of production rather than individual skill or innovation. What they increasingly encountered was something more disturbing: Americans who combined material abundance with frontier ingenuity, soldiers who did not wait for official solutions, but created their own, often with terrifying effectiveness. This was the ideological collision that the propaganda had not prepared them for. The Nazi worldview held that individualism was weakness, that strength came from subordination to collective will and central authority. American democracy was supposed to be chaotic, inefficient, incapable of producing the disciplined force necessary for modern warfare. Yet here was a farm boy from Iowa who had built a precision rifle from scrap metal and used it to destroy an entire patrol of supposedly superior German soldiers. Here was evidence that decentralized initiative, individual creativity, and democratic improvisation could produce military results that centralized control could not match. Raymond Hollis carried his improvised rifle through the rest of the Ardennes campaign and into the final advance into Germany. He never gave it a name, never decorated it, never treated it as anything other than a tool necessary for survival. But others in his division began to notice it, to ask about it. Officers from other units heard rumors and came to investigate. An army historian attached to Chaff headquarters visited the 99th Division in February and interviewed Hollis, taking detailed photographs of the weapon and notes on its construction. The historian, a professor of engineering from mid and civilian life, recognized the rifle for what it was, a tangible symbol of American industrial culture, translated into individual action, proof that the same impulses that had built the nations, factories and farms could be weaponized with devastating effect. The rifle's barrel, fashioned from aircraft aluminum alloy, represented American air superiority transformed into ground combat capability. The stock, modified from a captured German weapon, symbolized the American willingness to learn from and improve upon enemy designs without being constrained by them. The improvised sight, the jury-rigged trigger mechanism, the whole improbable assembly represented a philosophical approach to warfare that was distinctly American, pragmatic, innovative, unconstrained by doctrine or tradition. In March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and began the final push into the heart of Germany, Hollis's division fought through the industrial Ruhr region. The combat was urban now, building to building, often at ranges where his rifle's superior accuracy offered less advantage. But his symbolic value grew. New replacements arriving at the unit heard stories about the farm boy with the homemade sniper rifle. Some of the stories were exaggerated, inflated through retelling. Some claimed he had killed 50 men, 100, that his rifle never missed, that he could shoot through walls. Hollis ignored the mythology. He knew the truth was simpler and more complicated than legend allowed. The German soldiers facing the final onslaught experienced a comprehensive collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. The wonder weapons had failed to materialize or had arrived late and into few numbers. The American army they had been told would crumble had instead grown stronger with every mile advanced, and everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of American material abundance that seemed almost supernatural. Soldiers eating food from tin cans that German civilians would have treasured, the scouting equipment that still functioned simply because something newer had arrived, using ammunition with a profligacy that suggested infinite supply. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, a German officer captured near Dusseldorf in April, would later write in his interrogation report about the psychological impact of facing American forces. He described the moment of recognition that Germany had not merely been outfought, but outthought, that the entire ideological foundation of the Reich's military superiority had been a lie. He wrote about seeing captured American equipment, about examining an American soldier's personal gear and being astonished by the quality, the abundance, the casual waste. He wrote about hearing, through the rumor networks that persisted even in defeat, about Americans who built their own weapons, who modified and improved their equipment without waiting for authorization, who approached warfare with a dangerous creativity that German military culture had systematically suppressed in favor of discipline and obedience. For Weber and soldiers like him, the defeat was not just military, but philosophical. They had been taught that German discipline, German engineering, German martial culture would inevitably triumph over the soft democracies of the West. Instead, they discovered that democracy, with its messy individualism and decentralized initiative, could produce soldiers who were both materially supplied and individually dangerous. Men who brought to warfare the same innovative spirit that had built American industrial might. Raymond Hollis was present at the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11, 1945. His unit was among the first American forces to enter the camp, and what he saw there transformed his understanding of what the war had been about. He had fought, killed, risked death for months without fully grasping the moral dimensions of the conflict. He had understood it in simple terms: defending his country, protecting his fellow soldiers, completing the mission. But Buchenwald revealed something else, something that made the previous months of violence comprehensible in a new and terrible way. He wandered through the camp in a state of shock, seeing the living skeletons who emerged from barracks, seeing the crematorium ovens, seeing the mountains of personal effects stolen from the murdered. His improvised rifle hung from his shoulder, suddenly weightless, suddenly irrelevant. This, he understood, was what he had been fighting against, even when he had not known it. This was the logical conclusion of the ideology that had sent German soldiers marching across Europe with such confidence. This was the fruit of believing that some humans were superior to others, that efficiency and discipline and collective will matter more than individual dignity and democratic chaos. The rifle he had built from scrap metal and personal initiative, the weapon that had seemed so important just days before, was revealed as a small symbol of a larger truth. It represented the opposite of the ideology that had created Buchenwald. It was proof that individual creativity, exercised within a framework of democratic freedom, could achieve things that centralized authority could not. It was evidence that farm boys who thought for themselves were more dangerous than soldiers, who only followed orders, that improvisation could defeat planning, that American disorder contained a kind of order that Nazi discipline could never replicate. In the final days of the war, as Germany collapsed into chaos and unconditional surrender became inevitable, Hollis used his rifle less and less. The organized resistance was crumbling. Most German soldiers were trying to surrender to American forces, rather than be captured by the Soviets advancing from the east. The killing, while not yet ended, had taken on a different character: sporadic, desperate, meaningless. On May 7, 1945, when news arrived that Germany had surrendered, Hollis was bivouacked in a small Bavarian town whose name he never learned. He sat on the steps of a destroyed church, his rifle across his knees, watching liberated slave laborers and displaced persons stream past on the road, heading west toward safety and an uncertain future. Lieutenant Overton found him there and sat beside him in companionable silence. After a long while, the lieutenant asked if Hollis planned to keep the rifle, to bring it home as a souvenir. Hollis considered the question carefully. He had been offered the opportunity to ship personal equipment home, along with captured weapons and other mementos. Many soldiers were creating collections, taking trophies, assembling proof of their service and survival. But Hollis looked at his improvised weapon and saw something different. He saw the desperate circumstances that had required its creation. He saw the 20 men who had died to it on a frozen morning in January, and all the others afterward. He saw a tool that had served its purpose and had no place in the world that was coming. "No, sir," he finally answered. "I reckon I'll leave it here." 2 days later, he disassembled the rifle in the courtyard of a former German military barracks, carefully taking apart each component, separating what had been American from what had been German from what had been improvised. The barrel went into a scrap metal collection bin that would be melted down and reformed for peacetime uses. The stock he burned. The trigger assembly and sight he buried in an unmarked grave, as if they were a fallen comrade who deserved rest. By the time he finished, the weapon that had seemed so important no longer existed. It had returned to its constituent parts, to possibility rather than actuality, to the realm of what might be rather than what had been. Asterisk, asterisk. Raymond Hollis returned to Iowa in September 1945, sailing from La Havre on a Liberty ship packed with soldiers desperate to get home. He was 20 years old and felt ancient. He carried no souvenirs, no captured weapons, nothing but his service, records and his discharge papers and memories he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The Army historian's photographs and notes about his rifle disappeared into archives that would not be opened for decades. The official records of his service noted only that he had been an infantryman with the 99th Division, that he had participated in the Ardennes campaign and the final offensive into Germany, that he had been awarded a Bronze Star for valor that he never told anyone about. Morning Sun, Iowa, had not changed significantly during his absence. The same field stretched to the same horizons. His father's blacksmith shop still rang with the sound of hammer on steel. His mother still baked bread every Wednesday and attended church every Sunday. But Hollis himself had changed in ways that made the unchanged landscape feel surreal, as if he had returned to a place that existed in a different dimension from the world. he had inhabited for the past 2 years. He returned to farming, taking over more of the family's acreage as his father aged. He married a local girl, Alice Brennan, in 1947. They had 3 children. He joined the Rotary Club and the Farm Bureau and the American Legion Post, though he rarely attended the Legion meetings because he found he could not talk about the war in the ways other veterans did, could not reduce it to anecdotes or proud memories. He became known in the county as a man who could fix anything, who could look at a broken tractor or a failing well pump and understand immediately what was wrong and how to repair it. His neighbors sought his help, and he provided it without seeking recognition or payment, because that was simply what one did. He never built another rifle. He owned shotguns for hunting and a .22 for pest control, but he never modified them, never improved them, never applied the skills he had developed in that frozen Belgian forest. When his sons asked about the war, as they inevitably did, he told them only that he had served in Europe, that he had been lucky to survive. That war was a terrible thing best avoided. He did not tell them about the rifle built from aircraft parts. He did not tell them about the 20 men who had fallen on a January morning. He did not tell them about Buchenwald, though the images from that place visited his dreams regularly, unwelcome and ineradicable. The rifle existed now only in archives and in the fading memories of men who had been there, the Army historians. Reports sat in a file cabinet in the military history section of the Library of Congress. Unseen and unread, the soldiers who had witnessed Hollis's marksmanship scattered across America, returning to their own lives, and over time their memories, blurred and condensed, becoming stories they told at reunions, details that changed with each retelling until the truth was obscured by legend. But the rifle's symbolic importance remained, even in absence, even in the realm of forgotten history. It represented a moment when American industrial culture and frontier individualism combined to produce a kind of lethality that authoritarian systems could not replicate. It proved that democratic chaos, when channeled by skilled individuals, could outperform centralized planning. It demonstrated that the same qualities that made America rich and powerful in peacetime, ingenuity, improvisation, individual initiative, could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. The German soldiers who had expected to face off undisciplined Americans found instead men like Hollis, who brought to warfare the same creative energy that their grandfathers had brought to settling wilderness, that their fathers had brought to building industrial empires. The rifle built from aircraft parts was a small thing, one weapon among millions, but it contained within it a larger truth about the nature of American power. That power did not derive solely from factories and production lines, though those were crucial. It derived from a culture that encouraged individual problem-solving, that rewarded innovation, that trusted its citizens to think for themselves and act with initiative. This was the lesson the Wehrmacht learned late, in frozen forests and ruined cities, in 1,000 small encounters that accumulated into comprehensive defeat. The American army they faced was dangerous not just because it had more tanks and planes and artillery, though it had all those things in overwhelming abundance. It was dangerous because it was composed of individuals who had been raised in a culture that valued self-reliance and creativity, who did not wait for authority to solve problems, who approached challenges with a pragmatic determination to find solutions. Using available resources, Raymond Hollis died in 1987 at the age of 62 of a heart attack while working on a tractor in his barn. His obituary in the local newspaper noted that he had been a veteran of World War II, a respected farmer, a devoted husband and father. It did not mention the rifle. His children, going through his effects, found no evidence of its existence, no photographs, no souvenirs, no written records. They found his discharge papers and his Bronze Star citation, which mentioned valor in combat but provided no specifics. They found his dog tags and his service ribbons, but they found nothing that explained what he had done, what he had created, what he had been forced to become in that distant war. The rifle exists now only in history, in archived documents and fading official photographs, but its significance transcends its physical absence. It represents a moment of convergence between American industrial capacity and individual initiative, a demonstration that the qualities Americans valued in peacetime could become lethal in war. It proves that the same hands that could coax crops from difficult soil could build weapons from scrap metal. It shows that farm boys trained in improvisation and self-reliance could become more dangerous than soldiers trained only in obedience. The German soldiers who fell to that impossible rifle died believing they served a superior cause, that their discipline and training and ideology made them invincible. They learned otherwise in the moment of their death, learned that American democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could produce soldiers who were individually more capable, more innovative, more dangerous than any system built on authoritarian principles. They learned that material abundance mattered, but that creativity mattered more. They learned that freedom, messy and undisciplined as it appeared, contained within it a capacity for effective violence that totalitarian systems could not match. In the end, the rifle built from aircraft parts was less important as a weapon than as a symbol. It demonstrated that American power in the Second World War derived not just from assembly lines and production statistics, though those were overwhelming. It derived from a culture that trusted individuals to solve problems, that encouraged innovation at every level, that allowed farm boys to become engineers and engineers to become warriors. It proved that the frontier spirit that had built America could be channeled into defeating enemies who believed discipline and central planning would always triumph over democratic improvisation. The snow that fell on that Belgian hillside in January 1945 covered the evidence of that morning's violence, turning the killing ground into a pristine landscape that suggested peace. But beneath the snow lay a truth that would shape the remainder of the 20th century. American power, when fully mobilized, combined material abundance with individual initiative in ways that authoritarian systems could not counter. The rifle, that should not have existed, built by a soldier who should have been just another anonymous infantryman, proved that democracy's greatest weapon was not its factories, but its citizens. Not its planning, but its freedom. Not its discipline, but its creative chaos. Raymond Hollis understood this only dimly, if at all. He was not a philosopher or a historian. He was a farm boy who did what needed doing, who solved problems with available materials, who survived a terrible war and returned to the quiet life he had left. But in building his impossible rifle and using it with such devastating effectiveness, he embodied a truth larger than himself. He proved that American freedom, when tested by fire, could forge individuals capable of defeating any challenge, any enemy, any system built on the opposite principles. The rifle is gone now, returned to constituent elements, but its legacy remains. In every archive that documents American innovation, in every story of individual initiative triumphing over institutional rigidity, in every example of democratic improvisation defeating authoritarian planning, it reminds us that power takes many forms, that the same culture that produces abundance in peace can produce lethality in war, and that the greatest strength of free societies lies not in their ability to mobilize resources, but in their willingness to trust individual citizens to think, to create, to act without waiting for permission. Asterisk, asterisk. On a frozen morning in Belgium, a farm boy with a rifle that should not have existed taught this lesson to 20 German soldiers who expected to face a soft, disorganized enemy. They learned otherwise. The world learned otherwise. And somewhere in the archives of forgotten history, photographs of an impossible weapon remind us that American power has always derived less from what we build than from why we build it, less from our resources than from our freedom to use them creatively, less from our discipline than from our chaos, less from our obedience than from our stubborn, dangerous, utterly democratic insistence on solving our own problems in our own ways. This is the truth Raymond Hollis left behind, carved, not in monuments, but in memory, preserved not in museums, but in the example of what one individual with skill and determination can accomplish when necessity demands and freedom permits. The rifle built from aircraft parts spoke once, with terrible eloquence, about the nature of American power. Its echo, faint but persistent, continues to resound through history, a reminder that the strength of free people cannot be measured only in tanks and ships and planes, but must account for the ingenuity, the creativity, the relentless individual, initiative that democracy cultivates and authoritarian systems suppress. In the silence of Iowa fields, where corn grows where wheat once grew, where modern tractors work land that Raymond Hollis once plowed, the story survives in fragments and whispers. Old men at the Legion Hall remember hearing something about a soldier who built his own rifle. Historians occasionally stumble across the archived photographs and wonder about the weapon they depict, but mostly the story is forgotten, buried, like the trigger mechanism Hollis interred in German soil, waiting perhaps for a time when it might be needed again, when the lesson it teaches might once more become relevant. That lesson is simple and profound. In the contest between freedom and tyranny, between individual initiative and centralized control, between democratic improvisation and authoritarian planning, the advantage lies not with those who possess the most resources, but with those who trust their citizens to use resources creatively. The rifle built from aircraft parts was proof of this principle, forged in fire and proved in blood, a symbol of American power that transcended mere material abundance. To embody the dangerous creativity of free people determined to survive. The snow has long since melted from that Belgian hillside. The forest has reclaimed the ground where 20 men fell. Time has obscured the details, blurred the facts, transformed history into legend. But somewhere in the record, in photographs and documents and fading memories, the truth persists. A farm boy from Iowa built a rifle from salvaged aircraft parts and used it to deadly effect, proving that American soldiers brought to war the same ingenuity they brought to every other challenge, a pragmatic creativity that no amount of enemy discipline could overcome, a dangerous freedom that would help determine the fate of the 20th century, one impossible shot at a time, ***.